Ukraine has reportedly cleared the skies over Avdiivka of all Russian aircraft, and it's starting to pay dividends for the troops on the ground. I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. Let's talk about it. So, this is one of those no news is good news kind of days. You could see here that the only change to the front line has been near Yampolivka in this Crimea-Lyman axis, where we're seeing the small actual adjustment forward, showing Russian forces controlling just this little last nub of this windbreak here, and that Ukrainian forces still contesting over this larger windbreak here to the east of Yampolivka. But that's it for changes to the front line, which is huge because, as we talked about, there's been a lot of criticism, and I think probably some unfair criticism of Ukrainian armed forces in their withdrawal from Avdiivka. There was actually, I think it was a Washington Post article or a New York Times article that was like, why didn't the Ukrainians hold Avdiivka with, why didn't they have a defense in depth, basically? And they showed these aerial footage of hastily dug fighting positions on kind of the route out of Avdiivka. And it seems like a classic error by the New York Times. And this is what happens when you have people with no military knowledge conducting military reporting, is that they fail to realize that oftentimes when you have so the Russians had this elastic defense, and the idea was that the lines bend a lot, but they don't break. But that's only one theory of defense. And especially when you're someone like Ukraine who can afford to step back and have, again, as we talked about, more of a defense in depth. And this is where they have no plans to counterattack the Russian forces as they advance through Avdiivka. So the point was to fight them with hasty fighting positions and stall them out over several days while other Ukrainian forces were building the actual defensive lines at this Berdichi or Orlivka-Tonenka axis. And that's what we've seen, right? And as we pointed out, if you're going to build extensive fortifications, you should build them in places where the terrain is most favorable. And obviously using a river and an elevated position is the way to do it. And so the fact is that for almost 72 hours now, we haven't seen Russian forces make any substantive advances on the ground, says to me that this line, this defensive line, is well prepared and is adequately staffed. Now, it sounds, when you look over at the combat map, you could see Russian forces are putting this thesis to the test, engaging in basically a really high concentration of attacks here and a comparably high concentration of attacks near Ivansky and Klachivka. But again, what we're not seeing are changes to the front lines as a result of these attacks, which says that I think that Russia's pivoting more towards its conventional military tactics. And we're going to talk in a minute about some of the reasons for this, but if you're interested in seeing some of the combat footage from this fighting, you want to check us out on CombatNewscom. You guys know I depend on you guys, the viewers, to enable me to continue to do this coverage every single day. I actually haven't missed a day of coverage in almost 2 years. And the reason I do that is, again, because you guys are able to support me. So if you want, twice a week, I find the uncensored combat footage, the kind YouTube doesn't let me show you anymore. And I do a deep dive analysis about the units and tactics, and not just in Ukraine. I also will do footage coming to us from Gaza, even from places like North Africa. Anywhere that there is combat footage that's worth analyzing, we analyze it. So, of course, any one of these tiers will get you access to the videos. But if you want the shout-outs at the end and my eternal gratitude, you can pick up a lieutenant or colonel tier, or even the lieutenant yearly, which is just the lieutenant tier, but, you know, you save a little by paying for the year up front. Anyway, check us out, CombatNewscom. New videos dropping on Tuesday. So here's the thing that I thought was most significant is this little notification right here. Commander of the Ukrainian Air Force says skies over Ukraine are clear. And Russia didn't exactly yield this airspace willingly. By most accounts, and we'll pull it up here, according to ISW, the Russians, they didn't just send their aircraft home to refuel. The Ukrainian Air Force destroyed at least one Su-32 aircraft yesterday, and that brings the total since February to something like 15 Russian aircraft since February 17th, right? So 3 weeks, Russia's been averaging 5 aircraft lost per week, and that is pretty tremendous. And one of the things that we talked about during the Avdiivka battle is that towards the end of the withdrawal by Ukrainian forces, Russia briefly established air superiority. And Russia, I think, may have believed that that was a reflection of the fact that they had finally taken out all of Ukraine's air defenses. But realistically, it's probably because Ukrainian forces said, listen, air defenses are so valuable to the war effort that we're going to pull them out first. And we're going to reallocate them, again, probably to these defensive lines here or behind those defensive lines. And as a result, Russia may have believed that its aircraft could operate throughout the eastern area here unimpeded, when in reality, the Ukrainians probably had just finished setting up their aircraft and then caught the Russians being dum-dums, thinking that, you know, like rats thinking that the cat had been rehomed, but instead the cat was just taking a break for a little snack. And then it came back and found a lot of aircraft, a lot of a target-rich environment. And I think this correlates not accidentally with the Russian offensive stalling out. Right now, we've said, I think Ukraine is allocating more artillery and more resources to shore up this line. Even Syrskyi himself admitted there was a miscalculation in terms of the defense and withdrawal of Avdiivka. As we talked about, I thought they waited a little long to initiate their withdrawal. But I think the fact that these Russian ground troops don't have aircraft support, don't have close air support, is a huge reason why this Russian offensive is stalling out, right? As we've talked about, combined arms, when you have armor and infantry and aircraft and they work together, can really deliver powerful battlefield effects. But as we've seen in Ukraine's counteroffensive, if you're missing one leg of the chair, if you don't have aircraft that can support you, if you don't have good armored support, if your infantry support can't get to the battlefield, if you pull out legs of the chair, even one of them, then the combined arms battle tends to kind of collapse inward. And I think that's what happened to Ukraine in their counteroffensive. They never really got the air superiority that would have facilitated the whole rest of the process that made NATO tactics work. Like that was like the MSG in your Chinese food, right? It's the thing that makes it great, you know? I think Russia's found that out the hard way too, right? When their aircraft aren't able to provide CAS, the rest of their offensive starts to crumble. So anyway, that is really all I had for you guys. I did want to point out one more little story that I'm going to try to do a little more homework on, but I thought it was interesting. It appears some military aid still trickling into Ukraine via some kind of arms dealer, these contracts suggest. And the idea is that the Pentagon said that, of course, 5 companies won the right to compete for slices of a $400 million contract to provide, quote, special ammunition and weapons to the U.S. Army. And the companies that won, Northrop Grumman, a major defense contractor, Global Military Products, Blaine International, and Ultra Defense Corp, an awesome name, Ultra Defense Corp tagged in several weeks after that initial announcement. Now, for the Army, right, Northrop Grumman, Global Military Products got a $133 million contract. But none of these awards mention Ukraine or say anything about going to a foreign military. However, the interesting, when you look at who some of these companies are, things look a little weird, right? So the Global Military Products, right? Obviously, Northrop Grumman, both those companies have sold artillery shells to Ukraine, but there's nothing suspicious about that because they're Northrop Grumman. They're the largest U.S. weapons manufacturer on earth. Same with Global Military Products. They're one of the largest. But the other companies are a little weird, right? One of them, for example, Ultra Defense Corp, has basically been selling weapons to Ukraine since day one of the invasion. And actually, it includes howitzers that Ukraine later said had actually been defective. But Blaine International has actually been connected to Ukraine for at least 20 years. And the founder, Milton Blaine, was briefly noted for his connections to Felix Slater, a Russian-American businessman, a witness in Robert Mueller's election interference probe. But what's weird is that Blaine International operates out of a home address in the suburbs of Atlanta and lists his wife, Tatiana Blaine, as the CEO, CFO, secretary, and agent, which is really weird. Right? Imagine if someone knocked on your door and were like, you need to provide, hundreds of millions of dollars of artillery to Ukraine or to the U.S. Army, you'd be like, what? I don't even know how to go about it. And so a one-man operation to do that is pretty preposterous. But somehow this company bid for and won a large U.S. Army production contract. And the Pentagon's they speculate here that the Pentagon's use of a company with such a limited profile suggests that the firm is being used as a cutout to enable a third-party country to hide weapons transfers to Ukraine. This is according to Mark Kansian, a senior advisor at CSIS. Interesting. So the theory that they're putting forth here is that at least one of these companies is just sort of a front for Ukraine, who's actually going to receive the contract to manufacture the ammunition. And I suspect that there may be something where basically Ukraine might take the money and purchase ammunition from a third party and then just not deliver it, just fail to deliver on their contract. Something like that may occur. Again, in order to facilitate Ukraine purchasing ammunition on the global marketplace without necessarily having to go through the U.S. directly, right? Receiving money from the U.S. to purchase ammunition that they may or may not use. It's tough to know, right? You see this sort of stuff. The problem is when you have to play these games, you end up with a lot more fraud potential, right? Because the easiest way to prevent fraud is to keep every single thing you do above board. And once you have to play these games, you run the risk. Are we sure Ukraine will use it to buy ammunition? Are you sure nobody's going to skim some off the top, given that this is being used by a third-party entity, right? No audit agency is going to do an audit of them, right? What do you do? Audit somebody's house? Like, oh, you couch, check, So that's just stuff to think about. And one of those aspects that worries me when I see it, it's just easier to do these things above board. It's easy to track, easy to account for. Anyway, guys, that's all I had. Thanks to the Colonel members of Combat Vet News. Thanks to the Lieutenant tier members. Could not do this without you guys. I appreciate you so much. And I'll see all you guys in the next one.